attached to the Department of Strategic Studies, Faculty of Defense and Strategic Studies at the General Sir John Kotalawala Defense University. Our esteemed guest holds a PhD in International Relations from the University of Colombo, Sri Lanka, a master degree in International Relations from the University of Colombo, Sri Lanka, and a Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of Kalyan, Sri Lanka. Dr. De Silva was a former working group member of the Weapons of Regional Network for Strategic Studies Center, Washington, D.C., and he is also an alumnus of the United States University of Defense and the Near East and South Asia Center for Strategic Studies. Dr. Sanath also served as a member of the teaching staff at the college from 1993 to 1997. His research interests span nuclear disarmament and nuclear security in South Asia. Dr. De Silva has contributed as a visiting resource person at the Staff College in Sapagaskanda, the Sri Lanka Military Academy in Talawa, the Sri Lanka Air Force Academy in China Bay, and the Officer Career Development Center in Buttala. Moreover, Dr. De Silva completed his Advanced Security Cooperation course at the College of Security Studies at Daniel K. Nui Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies in Honolulu, Hawaii in 2016, as well as his being a scholarship recipient of the Generation 17 Asia Pacific Leadership Program at the East-West Center, Honolulu in Hawaii in 2017. Moreover, one of his publications, co-authored with Professor W.I. Sirivira, was nominated for the State Literary Awards in the category of Academic and Research in 2017. In addition to that, Dr. De Silva has written the research articles Maritime Boundary with India, Sri Lankan Experience, Sri Lanka Under the Nuclear Shadow in 2018, Nuclear Stability and Civil Military Relations in South Asia, IRC in KDU 2016, to name a few. Sir, we are deeply honored to have you with us here, and we warmly welcome you to deliver this lecture. Thank you.
Thank you. The topic here, I have chosen the topic as Bridging Sri Lanka's History with a Future and Cosmopolitan Approach. These don't think too much about these words like cosmopolitan approaches, and all these are very academic and very heavy words, but they have a very simple meaning. But what I'm trying to say here is why we need to think about the future and why history is very important when we think about the future, and why we need to include everybody and create a common identity or a universal identity in dealing with our future. So let's take a kind of an introduction about what history is. Normally, history is one of the oldest subjects that you study in the school, in the university, and even in the day-to-day life. If you ask from somebody what is history, they say it is the record, all about the past. So when it comes to the academic world, history is defined as a written record. And study about the past can be also falling into the subjects like archaeology. But history only deals with the past record. So in that sense, you can imagine or you can assume that history starts after the language started on Earth, right? Because the record started after the language was used by the human beings to keep the records. So it is the study of life in society in the past in all its aspects in relation to present developments and future hopes. So that is the most important thing that you need to grasp. History without future is meaningless. Any country dwell on history without thinking of future is actually useless. This is what has happened to most of the third world countries. They capitalize on history and they politicize history and they securitize history, but they don't futurize history. In the story of Man in Time, an inquiry into the past based on evidence. When I say based on evidence, it's all about, I mean, when you say evidence based study, that falls into a scientific study. The scientificness of the study, is decided upon the evidence, basically, and is the raw material of history teaching and learning. If you don't have evidence, I mean, evidence can be brought from many areas. Sometimes folklore is evidence, sometimes divine knowledge or heavenly knowledge is also evidence. Sometimes written record is the evidence. So therefore history is somewhat a scientific study, right? It's an inquiry into what happened in the past and when it happened and how it happened. It's all about incidents. And each and every body has a history. Each country has a history. It's all about human affairs. And how these human affairs had been evolved is a study about history. And how we relate this into our small island. Sri Lanka is a small island located in the middle of the Indian Ocean. And look at the map. I mean, this map that I have taken into this particular presentation shows how far I mean, the proximity to India, the closeness to India. We are actually by just 32 kilometers or 20 miles separated from a mainland, culturally heavily influenced or heavily strengthened country called Bharat or India. And on the other side, if you take the beyond the southern point, the southern tip of Sri Lanka, there's no islands that you can see. There is no landmass that you can see up to the southern, periphery. So that itself shows Sri Lanka is on one side heavily influenced by the sea culture, and on the other side, the northern side is heavily influenced by the land-based culture, which was the culture that was developed by the at the Indian subcontinent. So these are the two, you know, push and pull factors that created Sri Lankan history throughout the past. So Sri Lanka has a very long history. Very long history. When I say very long history, you have to concentrate on two factors about any of the past when you talk about anybody's past. That is the continuity of the past. That means the cultural continuity of the past and the chronological or time continuity of the past. So Sri Lanka's historical record has both chronological and cultural continuity. So prehistory is a time where before the recorded past, what happened before the recorded past, it can be studied only by looking at the archaeological evidences. So the time before written records, why I wanted to bring this prehistory is actually if you want to develop an identity for a small island like us, we need to know who we are, how we developed it, right? So, archaeological point of view of history is about the human existence. And Stone Age, Sri Lanka's Stone Age, the era that the man started to develop stones as tools, right? And where he used these stones by manipulating, by using hands, is called Stone Age, and that age is clearly visible in Sri Lanka. And Homo sapien balangudensis, we call it the Balanguda human, Balanguda man, was first discovered about 35,000 years back, and the latest discovery is about 125,000 years before. Remnants are there, evidence are there from Bundaland. So stone tools were found at places like Ammanthutta, Bundala, Vellaganguda, Pathirajavel, and there are so many places that you can find the prehistoric archaeological evidences of Sri Lanka. So, chronological and cultural continuity of Sri Lanka is intact, and nobody can deny that. So, 180, you know, 1880 BC, that means little bit earlier than Vijaya's arrival into Sri Lanka before Christ. Last evidence of the upper boundary of the Balanguda man was found by the archaeologist called a great researcher and archaeologist Sirandharani. So after that, you can see disappearance of this Balanguda culture. So this is where I want to start my story. Now, somebody can say, okay, we have an original route to this country. We have our human has been evolved in this country, and that's why this country is separate. And that's why this country is separated from India. That's why we need to talk about our own culture and everything. But now we can see as the seafaring is developing, as the communication is developing, new people coming into Sri Lanka, right? So by about 900 BC, archaeologists find a new advent of new cultural wave, like Anuradhapura, Salgahavatta, and Gelige. There are certain excavations. You can see a new kind of culture is being introduced into Sri Lanka. So I told you that there was a new wave of humans coming in. So my whole point is here. I mean, this is my own idea. It's not anybody else's idea. I totally responsible for giving this idea to you. You can challenge it and you can question it. What I say is, being an island, our nature itself is actually immigration and emigration and mixing with the other cultures. There is no monolithic culture in the world that has, there are only, closed door cultures you can't have. So Sri Lanka, being in the center of the Indian Ocean, is perfectly opened up to the entire world, and our strength was actually this mixing with other people. So that's where this cosmopolitanism comes into play. In simple words, cosmopolitanism means a universal culture, a universal value system, a universal or global value system where you can embrace anything good and leave anything bad. And so let's say by before Vijay's arrival into this country, you can see we start wet rice cultivation, because cultivation without using the waterways. Engineering and all these kind of factors were brought here by the waves of migrators who came from perhaps from India, perhaps from Indonesia, from Malaysia. You never know. I mean, there may be whoever who could reach the island could have come and settled down here, because Sri Lanka was a very nice and very beautiful island to stay. And from 1800s to 900 BC, there is a gap in our history. We call it abrupt history. And that history is covered most of the time. You cannot find the cultural transition at that period. If you take from 1800 to 900, something has happened somewhere, right? So I will tell you another example. Now, whenever a human being is, developing himself from a beast to a mankind, there is an age where he finds some kind of leisure, and the leisure brings him to do some kind of a creativity. So the creativity is coming. If you take this in Spain, there is this the world famous cave called Altamira, right? In even in Sri Lanka, there are so many thousands of caves where you should find some kind of we call them polychrome images, or images of images that were drawn by the people whenever they are developing their brains and their skills of creativity, and when they find colors and all on the walls of these caves. But those things are missing in Sri Lanka, most of the places. Very few polychrome images are being found, and the rock art in Sri Lanka is actually kind of a, depending on the number of caves that we have, the number of rock art pieces that we have is very less, right? Why is that? That is the, we call it the problem of recovery, because you know that when in 233 BC, when Arahat Mahinda came here with this emissary from Asoka, Emperor Asoka, we gave them 68 caves to live, not a big mansion or anything, but caves, because you can see even during that time people used to live in caves, right? And most of these caves, I think almost all the caves have been plastered, and they painted Buddhist paintings on those caves. So that's why we cannot recover the past polychrome images. That's why the history is abrupt from 1800s to 900. That may be the reason, right? And you can see uh, in this, archaeological records, and we have chronicle records as well. When you say chronicle records, it's the written record. Mahavamsa, Deepavamsa, Tupavamsa, Datavamsa, all these records. The beauty of it is in Sri Lankan history, most of these records tally with the archaeological record. When archaeologists go into the site and find something and interpret it in a scientific manner, that incident is being reflected sometimes, most of the times, in historical books. So therefore, Sri Lanka's having a strong history. But when you go back to this rock art, there are certain places in Monaragala district, in Ambilipitia, those areas, you can still see the places where humans cannot approach. Those rock arts are still there. There is another place called Kurullangoda, right? Polychrome image. You can see huge birds have been, you know, drawn on the walls where humans can't reach. So that itself shows that our development of our Homo sapien balangudensis was there. And then after 900 BC, it was disturbed by some migrations, maybe from various parts of the continent, various parts of the region. So there is a problematic, we call it dilemma, or in Sinhala it's called Ubatakotika, dilemmas of local history, the unsolved problem of local history. So these external forces who came to Sri Lanka resulted disappearance of Balanguda man. So if Balanguda man existed here, there wouldn't be Sinhala, Tamil, Muslim or anything, but something totally different. So Homo sapien Balangudensis, who were the real rooted man in this land, had a disappearance. So how do they disappear? I mean, now people who started seafaring and all now trying to come into Sri Lanka and settle down, and then the in-house people, what do they do? I mean, if somebody comes to your house and want to stay by force, wouldn't you retaliate? This retaliation should be there. You should repulse them. You should fight against them. But that was not seen. Did they resort a mountain, retreat to mountains because they could not face these new cultural traits? Now, new people comes with a new cultural trait, new civilization, civilization which was perhaps developed in India. But now those people were not being fought. I mean, there is no hardly any evidence that there was a fight between these two, except the fight that the war that was taken place according to Mahavamsa with the clan of Kuveni and Vijaya. Other than that, there is no evidence. So whether they retreated to mountain, whether they escaped to mountains, Balangura man could not be a weak human because a man who has a cultural continuity for thousands of years, 125,000 years almost, cannot retreat like that. You can't imagine that he retreats like that, right? Can an arrival of a small team change the genetic factors of a country? I mean, if just by coming, Vijaya comes and civilized this nation in one night, can it be possible? No. I mean, historically, scientifically, you can't think of it. But still, people like Professor Raj Somadeva, they are experimenting on this. This is called the twilight zone of history because this is very ambiguous. It's very shady, and the new historians they say nothing develops in linear fashion. Something like Vijay coming here was the withdrawal of Badanguda man. No, it doesn't happen that way. There may be many reasons and many results, many causes and many results, you know. And we have to think along with the global community in this problem. We have to think along with how the other historians think. What are the sources that we evolved from? What are the sources that we have to study our history? If I ask you, you may say the major source of historical evidence is Mahavamsa. Is Mahavamsa reliable enough for us to develop an evidence based historical record? So, those are the questions that we should ask. How do we create an evidence based knowledge base? How do we create a scientific knowledge? So, that's why the general consensus about a study of like history is that if you ask from an average person, they say, I don't like history because you have to remember all these years and names and etc. Some people might say it's an old record, nobody is going to use it. It is not the case. If you go to a country like United States or any developed country, the first thing that they teach you is to, they will ask you to, if you become a citizen, they will ask you to undergo a course of history because history is all about your identity. You should know who you are to develop your nation. If you are not, if you don't know your strengths and weaknesses, how do you develop your nation? To do that, you need to know what history tells about you. So, uh, so don't also think that you have the historical record is 100% true because historical record is written by somebody who is having biases. It can be written by many, it can be written by one person, it can be brought from one generation to the other by villagers or peasants. Oh, in that case, they make their preferences highlighted. For an example, if you take Mahavamsa author is so much biased towards Mahavihara and King together because the 37 chapters of Mahavamsa dedicates about 11 chapters to Duttagamini and his warfare. And it is very difficult even today if one person writes a book to have the implicit bias out of that writing. But history has something very nice. History is actually not exactly what happened, but history is what you interpret. Now, history can be interpreted as today's interpretation. History can be interpreted as 100 years before the interpretation of history may be different. For an example, I'll let you. I mean, you all must have heard that when Anuradhapura, Polonnaruwa, those cities were declined, all Sri Lankan people came down. Dabadaniya, Yapahu, Kurunagala, Gampola, Raigama, Kote, towards southwest. That decline is a famous decline because our historians say, modern historians, some people say, that took place partially because of malaria, right? Actually, that is a wrong interpretation. Why I say the wrong interpretation? Now, how can malaria come when you are there? Now, if somebody asks you that you abandon your house because your well contains frogs, but if you use your well while you are at home, frogs cannot be created in your well while you are using it, right? If you go out of your house for some reason, if you don't use your well for some time, then there is a logic to say that the frogs have been created, so now you can't. So actually, malaria could not be the cause of leaving. It can be the actually it cannot be the cause, but it can be the result of leaving. When people left Rajarata, malaria would have taken place. But even now, the archaeologists have not found any kind of archaeological evidence that there was malaria, genes found in archaeological artifacts. But wrong interpretation. In 1920s, when new historic books were written, right? Later 1800s and early 1920, there was a big problem of malaria in Sri Lanka. So that trickled down into the writings, and they thought this may be the case those days as well. So interpretation of history matters. How you interpret. Now, if I interpret history as a, a kind of a source of peace, if I say in this country, Sinhalese, Tamils, Muslims, Burghers, all these people lived harmoniously, that will become a source of peace. But if I politicize my history and say Sinhala is the majority, Tamil is the minority, others don't have a place in this country, let's go and safeguard our Sinhala Buddhism and all these things, it becomes source of conflict. So interpretation matters. Interpretation matters. If you read the historical record very carefully, you can even find that Uttagamini's warfare against Elara was not an ethnic warfare. It's a territorial warfare. It was interpreted in the 6th century as an ethnic warfare because there was an ethnic competition taking place between southern India and Sri Lanka during those days. But the real incident, there are so many evidences to say that it was not an ethnic warfare. So, what you need to understand is when you study history, you don't have to buy history as it is. You have the right to interpret it in a scientific manner for the benefit of your country, benefit of your future, right? And historians have their own preferences. Now, if a religious monk writes about the history, his value system is so different from a layman's value system. That's why, up to the colonial periods, there was no literature rather than the Jataka stories in this country. Every time, every literature piece was subjected to a Jataka story because they didn't want to do anything beyond the philosophy of Buddhism. So even now there is a problem of Sri Lankan history. We don't The interpretation of history has been politicized to a great extent, right? And that has not been taken place in the modern period. It was taken place from the beginning of Anuradhapura period. So therefore, the scientific history is yet to be, you know, presented by the researchers. But the trend in this country is that people go out of those areas. I mean, people are not interested in studying those areas because there's no market. The market is coming for the subject like history with the scientific approach. So the scientific approach is not there. The history becomes a aesthetic study. So when you study history, there are two types of sources. Sri Lankan's history can be studied in the local sources and the international sources. My argument is, we have studied the local sources extensively, but I think international sources are less biased than the local sources. The local sources itself, they say, like most of the books, when they when they when they write, they clearly say that they are written because of the faith towards Buddhism and the faith towards nationality and the race. So in such a context, you can see scientificness of the writings can be diluted to a great extent. I don't say that they are not valuable. They are valuable in cultural terms and in other ethical terms. But in scientific terms, to study history, even the foreign sources, people who have written about Sri Lanka, talks a lot. And that's where you find this cosmopolitanism. Sri Lanka being a place where a lot of cultures were uh, introduced, a lot of languages were introduced, a lot of people came here, a lot of genealogical mix has taken place, a lot of religious mix has taken place. So that is the unity in diversity kind of factor that you need to find out. So in such a case, in the second century BC, you can see Periplus Maris Erythraean Sea. It's called the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. It's a kind of a journal that was written by the uh, merchants who came and visited this place, and you can see this map. It says, it shows the places where they uh, sold wine, silk, metals, spices, where the Roman Empire is. This is where the entire trade has been taken place. Horn of Africa, the Arabian Sea, Sri Lanka, all these places were really, really, it's rich, and entire commerce, 1/5 of the world's production those days was taking place in this area, right? Sri Lanka was one of the major wheels in this production cycle. So, to understand Sri Lanka's commercial character, to understand Sri Lanka's multiple character, you need to go to these foreign sources. Pliny, Ptolemy, Aristotle, and there are so many, even Russians, Ibn Battuta, the Egyptian, Fume Sang, Fahian. There are about hundreds of people who has, even people like Somerset Maugham, the latest, not Somerset Maugham, it's Ernest Hemingway. Ernest Hemingway has visited Sri Lanka and he has written about Sri Lanka. So large record of about Sri Lanka. And that particular record created a narrative for Sri Lanka. If you don't, I don't know whether you remember, maybe Dr. Hemanta might recall this. When we were small, we were told that Sri Lanka is famous for hospitality. When we wrote our essays, when we were very small, we were asked to write essays in the Montessori and grade 1 and 2. We always write Sri Lanka is a beautiful island, and second line is always we tell Sri Lanka is famous for hospitality. Ideal hashtag for tourism, right? Now you have to see what has happened to that hashtag from time to time. It has been deteriorated to, I mean, nobody now tells that Sri Lanka is famous for hospitality. But that narrative has been developed not only by us, it was by all the people who visited Sri Lanka. So by without understanding that, you cannot build a new narrative for Sri Lanka, right? So that's why it is very cosmopolitan. It is very multicultural. It is very multi-ethnic. We actually speaking, people accepted it from the times of Anuradhapura period. If you go to Anuradhapura period, fifth century, when Kashyapa deviated a little bit from Anuradhapura and he went to Sigiriya, and he started his own kingdom where he found he developed a coin. Those days, like American dollar, everybody dealt with the coin with the Caesar's head, Julius Caesar's head on it. But a similar coin was designed by Kashyapa by putting his head on it for international trade. That has been found by the archaeologists, right? So that is why you need to understand the trade character of Sri Lanka. So that's where the cosmopolitanism comes in, right? And commerce with Roman Empire, right? Coasts of the Red Sea, how we, engage with that, and Horn of Africa. So Indian Ocean and all these places have a special meaning towards us. So that's why, do you think that Sri Lanka was called by many names like Taprobane, Sealand, Ceylon, Serendip? All these names were called because it was a famous joint, famous place, famous center. Otherwise, people wouldn't have known about Sri Lanka, right? Sri Lanka was that important. Important because of multicultural and multi-ethnic character. And so later you can see the state formation took place in Sri Lanka in between two major rivers, Mahaveli River and Malwatu. Yeah? So the Rajarata civilization lasted for 1,400 years. I'm not going to talk about that. And both indigenous and migrant populations lived, especially during the times of early times of Anuradhapura. There was a perfect blend of Sinhala and Tamil. That's why emperors or kings like Elara used to rule for 44 years. I mean, it's 4.5 decades, you know. So you can see later the declining of Rajarata and then people coming down. And then the starting of colonialism. Actually, 13th century was a decisive factor when Kalinga Maga came and divided Sri Lanka into two parts ethnically. He was the one who started the Jaffna Kingdom. And Sinhalese coming down towards Rajarata, and Tamils went up towards Jaffna. So that's how the division was taken place, because Kalinga Maga's invasion was ruthless and we couldn't stand it, right? All the other time, this Panchadravida, Saptadravida, Chola, all these invasions we could, resist it. But Maga's invasion we couldn't, so we were fed up, and then we came down. And uh, because of that, because of that, we can see the division took place. The ethnic division took place. Later, there was another king called Jatavarman Sundara Pandyan who strengthened the Jaffna kingdom. And then, you know, the ethnic division took place to a great extent. And uh, by the time the colonialists came, good source for them to come and have their power swayed, because the country was divided. When 1505 these migrants came, the country was divided. It was easy for them to spread their culture and everything. So that was also a plus point, according to my knowledge. You are mixing with European cultures than, earlier than the other countries. your introduction to the Europe was very, very fast. And the culture that we absorbed was very, very fast. And in such context, you can see in times of Kandyan kingdom, uh, kings like Vimaladharma Surya. He's not been praised by Mahavamsa, but historical record shows Vimaladharma Surya was a perfect blend. He found a perfect blend between Buddhists and Catholics. He was married to Dona Katerina, who was a Catholic, and king supported all these religions equally. And he even had a winery to support the temple, so the Catholic Church. So people started getting mixed, and people started getting good things on the culture. People started following the technology. You can see after invention of gunpowder to Sri Lanka, Sri Lankans started preparing their own guns, muskets, and even small artillery pieces. So those things were, we can't say that Sri Lankans just retreated when the others came. No, they blended. So that was the strength that we had. But overall, what is overarching shadow of all these things? The 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 most uh, powerful inclusion or introduction, or most powerful, I don't want to use the word invasion, but its kind of introduction to Sri Lanka was the introduction of Buddhism in 233 BC. So it was overarching everything. So under this particular context, right, how do we talk about the future? I mean, this is a kind of a little flavor about what our history is. Now, next part, after the break, I'm going to talk about how do we think about the future. How do we think about our futures? How do we design our futures in this context? How do we bring those into the future? How do we plan our future, desired future, by using our history? So now just forget everything that we discussed, right? I mean, that's only a story that I wanted to bring some kind of simulation. But this is the argument that I want to develop. This is the area that I want young researchers to think. How do we become cosmopolitan? How do we become, what is the value of becoming cosmopolitan? It is the idea, as I told you, that all human beings are members of a single community, right? This is a very, very strong idea, persuaded even by a German philosopher called Immanuel Kant. And some people believed that we can abolish the national armies, you know, and humans can generate society under a representative global institution. They're idealistic. I mean, even to a great extent, United Nations is actually found on those grounds. And so, what else? Cosmopolitanism has a very strong link to Buddhism, right? And even in Buddhist literature, in Pali, there is something called cosmopolitan concept that neglects or disregards all the castes and all the unnecessary things, but the core values of human being, right? And the Buddhist social thought is based on cosmopolitanism. Why we should become cosmopolitan is because I can see the market value of cosmopolitanism in the modern day world for a country like Sri Lanka. If our main income holder or income generator, one of the main income generators is tourism, And if we know about the cultures, if we know the value of the cultures, and we know how to respect those cultures without undermining, again we can revive that narrative of hospitality again. So that is one thing that you need to think of, right? And also, I would I would also give you one good example. The new generation, the Generation Z, does not know the ethnic or racial differences. That is one good thing about this internet generation. More than, I mean, we belong to you know older generations. Uh, you know, we call, I mean, our generation is called X generation. We are in between the internet generation and the baby boomers. But our generation, sometimes some people value those things. Sometimes some people value religion, race, those things. But the new generation, they don't value those petty things, but they value core of humanity, regardless of their color, ethnicity, the language that they speak, nothing. So universal evaluation of human being under cosmopolitanism. So it is an essential quality for future development of Sri Lanka, because otherwise we become a narrowed down nation where other nations will, you know, not take any care of. So under this cosmopolitanism, how do you bridge future and history? So E.H. Carr was one of the historians, the great historians lived. You must have gone through all these. I mean, your Generation Z values are basically grounded with the characters decided by Marvel or DC Studios, right? Much before the Marvel, okay, DC comes, I mean, the Superman, Spider-Man, Batman, all these men. There was a man called Invisible Man. There was a novel. That novel was written by E.H. Carr. He's an historian as well as a scientist. A man who develops a chemical. When he drinks that chemical, he becomes invisible. So those days when we were very small, that was the first man who came into action before Superman, was the Invisible Man. And he has given a very good definition for history. He says, history is a dialogue between the past, present, and the past. Right? I have put it in German also for your further references. The dialogue between present and the past. Actually, if you speak about history, present, and future, only existing thing is the present. Future and the past is abstract, right? So, future is, if you ask somebody to define future, it is the time to come, or what's going to happen, or according to Webster Dictionary, an expectation of advancement of progressive development. Everybody likes to have progressive development. So, how do you bridge these two? I have a very nice experience which I want to share with you. When I was in once in the US, I went into the university, one of the major universities in the US, and I asked, I wanted to go and visit the history department. And when I walked past, I saw the Department of Future Studies. Department of Future Studies. And I stopped there and nobody was there, but later I made it a point to go there and speak to the head of the department. And I asked, what do you teach? And he said, what is your area of study? I say, I did my bachelor's major is history, but now I'm into international relations. But the head of the department said, if you can do a PhD in history, why can't you do a PhD in future? So future studies is a discipline, emerging discipline in the United States, especially from 1960s, and it is actually talking about futuristic strategic assessments. What would be the alternative future? what type of futures that we can design. Because future is what we do today, right? You have to accept that. So the what we do today, how do we create tomorrow or 10 years? After 10 years or after 20 years, what do we do? What do we need? And what are the decisions that you need to take now if you want a better world after 20 years? You know that Germany started the recycling projects in 1950s, and now Germany has become world number one, recycling and reprocessing in environmental, their environmental damage is very, very less in that case. And they know how to preserve their water resources and everything. And they started on time. And we actually, if you take the water resource in Sri Lanka, very one of the best in the world. Sri Lanka is number fifth in the biodiversity indicator in the world. But have we started protecting our resources for the future? Have we started strategizing our resources for the future? So that's what future is all about. So history is important to make sure that you go on the right path to the future. You have to bridge these two. In our universities, if you don't teach future with history, that is actually a great deficiency, because then history becomes very, very old-fashioned subject. So, how do you design the future? Future designing is all about foresighting. It's not forecasting. Forecasting is something that you base. Forecasting is something. I give you a good example. Now, uh, if you take our rainfall pattern data for the next for the past 20 years, we know in the next 5 years what the rainfall is going to be. That is forecasting. But a futurist or a foresight person will do, he will dream about what we want actually in the next 5 years. According to the forecast, it may be drought, but what the society needs is full of rain and full of cultivation, and also he dreams about it and he comes up with a solution. That's how people went into moon, right? That's how uh, people started all these automobiles and all. Now they say if you stop your uh, all carbon emissions today, even if you stop it by this particular moment, you're still going to meet the big problem of environmental pollution by carbon emissions one day. So what is going to be the solution? The solution is not yet there, but generation C, and after generation C, new generations will come. They are supposed to dream about it. They are supposed to be creative about it. They are supposed to be thinking about it in a out of the box manner and find out solutions. So that's the only guarantee that we are going to overcome these problems in the future. Otherwise, if you forecast our future, we will be destroyed. If you forecast human future, things that we have done so far, things that we have utilized so far, will make sure that forecasted future will destroy us. But foresighted future is not like that. So we always should have not there is only not one single future. There can be alternative futures. If you think about future today, there can be many futures. There can be many ways that you can design the future. Very what you call the strategic foresight. So it is all about engaging systematically with future in order to make better decisions today. Have you ever thought about that with your life? When you are in the university, have you ever thought where you want to be in next 10 years? Or have you ever taken a decision that will make you go into that path or be successful in that path? So that's how the countries work. The Millennium Development Plan of United States was drawn in 1960s by the futurists. So all these policymakers should think about future. I have never seen anybody talking about future apart from, you know, just consuming whatever you have at the moment, the ad hoc policies and all. So there should be insight about the future. It is not about all about that you talk about future. You can talk, you can have so many insights about future, but whether you have the capacity to transform those insights into a strategy and make it happen is all about your future. We are lagging behind that. So that's why we are complaining every day to the government, to the policymakers, to the politicians and all, because our education system is lagging behind the futuristic insight and its capability to transform our future into a better future, right? How do we engage with what might be happening in 10, 20 years time? I mean, whenever now everybody's talking about, okay, we want leaders without corruption, we want leaders without education and all. Have you ever thought what the world is going to be in next 10 years, and whether we have thought about our leaders in that particular situation, whether we have produced the leaders who can face the technological developments of the world? It's very sad to say, if you compare with India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and all these South Asian countries, Sri Lanka is technologically heavily outdated country. Why Sri Lanka? Sri Lanka is technologically outdated in this soil, but overseas there are so many intellectuals who are technologically very much updated and running the technological programs like NASA for the United States or for any other country. Our people are leading in those places, but the country doesn't have that insight within our soil. So this is where we need to bridge these two, history and future, together. Historians, they clusterized and they, boast about their future glory. But nobody talks about historians are the ones who come out and tell the others about, okay, this was the history and this is what we desire about the future. So this is not, that discourse is not happening in Sri Lanka. So that's why I want you to think about it whenever you study about, if you happen to study history or if you happen to study strategy, anything you happen study, think about the futuristic aspect of it, not just the historical thing. And when you prepare for your future, you become well prepared for anything, right? And you become a person with a lot of resilience, right? And you avoid day-to-day decision making. It's like edavela. We call it edavela in colloquial language. You avoid that, and you allow strong strategy with a strong vision, right? And don't think that some people say don't think about long term, just think about short term and then think about. No, you should think long term and short term at the same time, because short term matters in long term. So you should be able to envision those two together. There is no strategy only short term. There should be a strategy long term and short term. There's only time difference, right? And there should be a strong dialogue between institutions and individuals. Only individuals think about future, and if the institutions don't be futuristic, that becomes very pathetic. If you take the private sector of this country, if you take mobile companies, I don't want to mention the name, but certain mobile companies, they are very futuristic. They have gone so, I mean, they have gone on 5G, they have gone on paperless, they've gone on so many things, applications, very futuristic. There are certain garment industries, They what they do is, they hire people to develop futuristic ideas. That's how they become number one in the world. When the entire economy collapses, Sri Lanka has some garment industries world leading for certain brands. How do they do that? Because being futuristic, right? So there should be a discourse on futures in the universities. If you want to do your masters, if you want to do your PhDs, try to select at least area where you they discuss about futures, because futurists are being paid very highly. Futurists can see the world, futurists can see the future strategies. So finally, uh, so we are very experts on selecting leader to maintain what we have or to maintain what we had. So we don't need leaders to do that. We need leaders to give us the world that we desire, world that we imagine. People who can, give you the room to fail. If you don't have room to fail, you will never be succeeded, right? Can you go to a bank in Sri Lanka and ask for a loan of 500,000 rupees for you to start a company? In other countries, in Southeast Asian companies, yes, you can. If you fail, the government will absorb the cost. But in Sri Lanka, we don't have that openness to ideas. So you slowly, I mean, these things cannot change overnight, but at least you should have the seed. Always think positively. Don't think of always going into a job and working under somebody. Think that you can create something and bring that aspect back to the economy. You have the capacity. You should work beyond those limits. You should be creative beyond those limits. So that's where all these subjects helps you, especially subjects like history. Otherwise, if you bog down in history, if you hang on to this racism, if you hang on to this cultural hypocrisy, you will never be a man. You will never be a universally accepted human being. So the transformative power of a society and its citizens matters. So this is the best time for us to think about transforming our country into a better place. So think about that. So I would thank Dr. Hemant for his kindness for giving me an opportunity to talk to you. And I hope that I simulated towards your main overarching theme on Asian ideology. Asian ideologies have gone so far and we are so lagging behind. Look at Chinese, Asian century, the China's emergence, Indians' emergence, Japanese emergence, all these things are there for us to learn. So come out with good creative ideas and do something, at least something for the betterment of this country in the future. Thank you so much and thanks for your patience listening. You can ask questions. We have about 10 minutes. You can ask questions if you have any. So I would love to answer you.
Dr. Sanath, thank you very much for your interesting and informative actually presentation. I think that there is one question in the chat box. Can you please, uh, maybe a little bit a long one? Yes. Can you
Right.
please
Yeah.
see
Yeah.
in the chat box?
Let me, let me, let me. I just will open
It is from Kasun.
chat. Yeah, I think, yeah, it's bit, okay. I asked this question
Yes.
because
Yes.
history is the best tool to shape the future. The wars of the future not with the use of weapons as in the past. Future wars are cyber wars. 21st century arms race is virtual one. Instead of training the soldiers, the state is developing the viruses. So my question is, as the third world country, powerful India and a close friend of China, how should Sri Lanka prepare for this future cyberspace arms race? What is your opinion? So it is actually, I since you asked, I'll tell you what my opinion is. Uh, but I don't know whether it's very ethical for us to talk about the weapons. But since you asked, it's the reality. Uh, my point is financially, economically, and even culturally, we are not in a position to go into this kind of, we call it revolution in military affairs. The revolution in military affairs says to bring the human component down and to increase the technological component of which engages a huge amount of money. But we have a role to play in this particular place because whatever the tool is, the man will behind the tool, will be behind the tool, right? The cyberspace or whatever, the man's intention will be behind it. So it is the destruction, and the mode of destruction is going to be different. But if you say that uh, if the role that we can play in this is essentially not the hegemonic or dominating role in violence, but the peaceful role. Sri Lanka can, I mean, if you take now, forget about 10 years' time or 5 years' time, now Sri Lanka is in the middle of a highly nuclearized region. So, what Sri Lanka can do is not to become another nuclear state. It's impossible at this particular time. But Sri Lanka can become morally high valued state where Sri Lanka can be a good platform for the other states to come and solve their problems. Sri Lanka can play a mediatory role like Sirimao Bandaranaike played in 1970, 1965, the Indochina War. Sri Lanka is a perfect place for the region to come and discuss about peace. When you have a place to discuss about peace, nobody will fight in such places because the environment is such. Uh, Dr. Hemant might know that there is a place in Japan. I've heard, I have never been, but they uh, follow something called hot springs diplomacy. So whenever there is an opponent who wants to talk about their conflict, before the discussion, this is what I've heard, they take both the parties to these hot springs and ask them to remove all the clothes and have a bath together. In that way, you bring the status quo to zero, and it's easy for you to, talk. So those type of things, because Japan, after the Second World War, Japan was devastated, but Japan still has emerged as a morally high moral. Japan was the one, had a very big war machine during the Second World War. But now Japan is, everybody talks about Japan as a morally valued state. Japan morals, then Japanese, ways of life, and all these things. Japan has brought it into a level where everybody respects with all these violence, right? So that's how we have to follow a very strong policy of peace. That's my answer to it. I mean, that's my way of thinking. Somebody, a hardcore realist might say it won't work. You have to become a powerful, violently powerful state. But I think knowledge is the best. I mean, see Cuba. Cuba exists with United States. They have transformed from sugar to knowledge. Their strength was, producing sugar. Now their strength is producing knowledge, producing doctors, producing engineers, producing lawyers. So that's how Sri Lanka should follow a path with a moral, you know, uh, morally strengthened. So that's my answer. But this is a good question that you have stipulated.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to deliver the word of thanks on behalf of the students of the short course on cultural linkages towards an Asian ideology. First, I would like to thank our lecturer, Dr. Sanath de Silva, for sharing his time and knowledge with us and for delivering today's lecture amidst his busy schedule. Sir, we are blessed to have you contribute to this course. Next, I wish to thank Dr. Hemant Premaratna, the course coordinator of this course, and the other staff of KDU who have brought these lectures together. Thank you. Last but not least, I thank all the participants from our university for joining us today. Your participation has made this lecture a successful event, and I believe it has provided you with an insight into bridging Sri Lanka's history with her future, a cosmopolitan approach. To conclude, let me once more express my gratitude to Dr. Sanath de Silva for accepting our invitation and delivering today's lecture. Sir, it is an honor to have you with us, and your time and efforts are deeply appreciated.